So let me get this straight. Canada's head of state is heading to Washington to honor Donald Trump, a man convicted of 34 felony counts, found liable for sexual abuse and defamation, and repeatedly linked to the Epstein story in newly released files. And we're supposed to treat this as normal diplomacy? No. It looks weak, it feels insulting, and for Canadians, it lands like a slap in the face.
Exactly, Dave. This isn't just some royal photo op with flags and silverware and everyone pretending history is adorable. Trump has spent the last year threatening allies, invading countries, and causing illegal wars, all while trashing democratic norms and treating countries like Canada as if we're just there to be pushed around. So, watching the King of England go smile politely for cameras in Washington? Sorry, but I'm not in the mood to curtsy.
Charles and Camilla are due in Washington from April 27th to the 30th, and Charles is set to address Congress on April 28th. That makes this his first state visit to the United States as king, and the first state visit by a British monarch there since Queen Elizabeth in 2007. So, this is not just a stopover. This is a big symbolic event.
And that's the problem, because symbolism is the whole job of the monarchy. Canadians are constantly told the monarchy is harmless because it's mostly just ceremonial. Well, fine. Then let us judge it on ceremony. If your main value is symbolism and your big symbol is bowing to Trump's orbit at this moment, then the symbol is rotten to the core.
And just so everyone appreciates the absurdity here, Charles is going to Congress to mark the 250th anniversary of the United States declaring independence from Britain. So, apparently, the best way to celebrate America leaving the crown is to invite the crown back for applause.
There's also the Canadian angle that people are dancing around because, well, it's just awkward. Charles is not just Britain's king, he's Canada's king too. Our constitutional system still says that. So when he goes to Washington and lends prestige to Trump, well, that's just not some British side story we can shrug off. That is our own head of state helping add polish to a man who has spent years dulling every democratic surface that he touches.
And just to be clear here, Trump was found liable for sexually abusing E. Jean Carroll, but the judge later made clear that yes, what the jury found was rape in the ordinary meaning of the term. Trump is all over the Epstein files, the same files that made Charles strip down his own brother of his royal title. So, when the files are enough to convict Andrew, the UK is turning a blind eye to Trump, who Epstein himself said was his best friend. The hypocrisy here is astounding.
To be fair, Charles probably cannot just wake up, throw on a cardigan and say, "No thanks, I'll skip Washington." Because state visits happen on the advice of the government. In plain English, that means that this state business is arranged through official channels.
Fine, but that's not really a defense, is it? No, it's not. That just shows the deeper problem. If the monarch goes where governments tell him to go, says what governments need him to say, and performs diplomacy for other states while also being our head of state, then why is Canada still tied to somebody else's theater?
Exactly. And this is where the monarchy starts looking less like a proud tradition and more like one of those family cottages that nobody wants to admit is falling down into the lake. You know, everyone keeps painting the porch, but the foundation is gone. In Canada, we keep pretending that this arrangement serves us, yet when the interests of Britain, the United States, and Canada drift apart, guess whose priorities come last?
Ours. Always ours. Britain wants a smooth relationships with Trump after all the recent tensions. Trump wants the royal seal of respectability since he has no credibility outside his mega bubble. And Canada gets told to smile politely while our own supposed sovereign power is represented by a monarch flying into the capital of a man who keeps menacing allies and dragging his country through scandal after scandal.
Reuters says that the British government hopes this visit helps prepare ties with Trump. And that tells you everything. This trip is about British diplomacy first, and Canada, well, we're just side scenery.
And then there's the Epstein angle, which makes the whole thing feel even more disgusting if that's possible. The Justice Department released millions of files in early 2026, and Trump's name shows up repeatedly in the broader Epstein universe more than anyone else, and that alone makes royal pageantry around him feel grotesque.
Thank you. His name has been a part of the Epstein story for years. He called Epstein a great guy. And Trump has also already publicly admitted to grabbing women by the kissing women without consent, and walking into the Miss Teen Universe dressing rooms with half-naked children on display. Yes, children. Now that's plenty. You do not need a megaphone when the facts are already holding a marching band.
And that leads to one of the most awkward pieces of this whole trip. Charles stripped Prince Andrew of military affiliations and royal patronages after the Andrew Epstein scandal became intolerable for the monarchy. In other words, the palace already knows that proximity to this world is absolutely toxic. So now the same institution is going to Washington to honor Trump, a man whose own legal and reputational baggage is enormous. It's not exactly a lesson in moral consistency. Definitely not.
Moral consistency left the building ages ago. This is the monarchy in a nutshell. Very stern when it needs to protect itself. Very flexible when power and prestige are on offer. They can freeze out Harry, shove Andrew into the basement, and lecture the public about duty, but when the White House calls, suddenly everyone finds a tuxedo.
And this is where the monarchy's double standard becomes impossible to ignore. Charles distanced the institution from Prince Andrew because Andrew had become too toxic to carry. Fine, understandable. But if that's the standard, then where is the moral consistency now? You cannot spend years trying to scrub one stain off the upholstery and then throw a banquet for another man surrounded by his own mountain of allegations, lawsuits, convictions, and Epstein-linked scrutiny. And for Canadians, the insult is sharper because Trump has not exactly hidden what he thinks of us. He treats countries as useful or useless depending on what they can do for him. He threatens, humiliates, and bullies, and then expects applause when the people crawl back into line. So, to watch our supposed head of state down there now feels like the constitutional version of sending flowers to the guy who just keyed your car.
There's also the bigger geopolitical issue under all of this. The monarchy made more sense in an era when Canada's foreign policy and Britain's foreign policy, and hey, the wider Atlantic alliance often moved in the same basic direction. Now that world is gone. Canada has its own interests, Britain has its own interests, Europe has its own interests, and the United States under Trump has become a giant stress test for every democratic ally in the world.
Right, so maybe this is the real lesson here. The monarchy is not offensive only because it's old. It's offensive because it no longer matches political reality. Canada is expected to act like a full sovereign country when it comes to trade, security, and diplomacy. But our constitutional head of state is still bound up in British state theater. We're told to think independently while symbolically outsourcing the top of the system.
But it is about whether Canada has outgrown the arrangement itself. Because if the Crown cannot represent Canada clearly, when Canada's interests and British diplomatic choreography are pulling in different directions, then what exactly are we preserving?
Does this institution serve Canadians now? Not in 1952, not in some sentimental wartime documentary. Now, in a world of trade wars, democratic instability, and allied realignment. Does it help Canadians to have a foreign monarch as our head of state? Well, looking at this Washington trip, my answer is absolutely not.
We need a Canadian head of state for a Canadian democracy, a constitutional system that reflects this country, stronger direct ties with Europe, which we're doing, where our values and practical interests align, a serious sovereign identity, not this half-detached arrangement where we are forever translating ourselves through someone else's crown.
And yes, before someone jumps into the comments, I know Canada cannot just waltz into the European Union tomorrow like it's joining a book club. Although, France has already raised the issue and nobody laughed. Remember that? In fact, everyone in the room cheered and clapped.
So maybe it's not as far-fetched as we think. Maybe it's time to change our strategic direction, deepen ties with Europe, build democratic partners, and stop changing our national identity to Buckingham Palace and calling it stability. Because this is not stability. This is a habit in a velvet robe.
The Governor General conversation belongs here too, because that office is supposed to be the domestic face of the crown in Canada. But more and more, it feels like an expensive constitutional echo. If the monarchy no longer reflects where Canada's headed, then keeping the local representative of that monarchy, on taxpayers' dimes I might add, starts to feel less like continuity and more like maintenance on an old symbol that has completely lost the room.
And all of this is why this visit annoys me so much. It strips away all the fairy dust of the monarchy, and it reminds Canadians that the crown is not some neutral little postcard. It's a live constitutional link to a system that still places a foreign monarch at the top of our state. And when that monarch goes to honor Donald Trump at a moment like this, well, the whole arrangement just looks ridiculous.
Now, Charles, to his credit, he may try to walk the line carefully. He'll probably keep the tone lofty, vague, and full of language about friendship, history, and domestic bonds. That is what monarchs do. But the setting matters more than the actual script. You can wrap a contradiction in polished phrases, but it's still a contradiction. And this one is too impossible to miss.
Because the real image people will see is simple. Trump gets the royal treatment. He thinks that the world loves him and that the monarchy loves him and whatever he's doing is right, while Canada gets the side eye. And by the way, Epstein survivors, they get no audience with the king. And when the monarchy gets one more chance to prove it belongs in the modern world, well, it only shows us once again that when power calls, principle suddenly becomes very flexible, and they belong back in the last century.
So can Charles even deny visiting? Well, in practice, not really. Not without detonating a constitutional crisis. But that is almost besides the point here. The better question is why Canada is still tied to an institution that keeps putting us in these absurd positions in the first place. If this trip does anything useful, well, maybe it's this. Maybe it reminds Canadians that symbolism is not trivial. Symbols tell you who matters, who gets honored, and whose comfort comes first. And when the symbol at the top of your country is flying to Washington to flatter Donald Trump, that should tell you something important about whether the institution still fits the country beneath it.
So let us know how you feel about Charles visiting the USA. Should Canada push to separate from the monarchy, or is it the institution that still holds us together?
And if you know any other royal watchers, share this video to raise their blood pressure, because you know it will.
And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you don't miss a thing. And check out the pinned comment below for all the good stuff like the merch, our Substack, and our Facebook group.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.